And that name shocked everyone involved, because the man who climbed through Fawn Cox's window that night wasn't a stranger. He was family. Before we go further into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. New cold cases every week. The summer of 1989 settled over Kansas City, Missouri, with the thick, familiar humidity of a Midwestern July. This was a city built on jazz and barbecue, on working-class neighborhoods where people knew which car belonged to which house, where kids grew up on streets familiar enough that parents let them play outside without a second thought. Fawn Marie Cox was 16 years old that summer, growing up in one of those northeast Kansas City neighborhoods. She lived with her family in a house near East 9th Street and Van Brunt Boulevard, a tight, generational community where families had lived for decades, sometimes longer. Fawn wasn't a girl who spent her summer idle. She worked part-time at Worlds of Fun, the city's big amusement park, earning her own money with a level of responsibility that not every 16-year-old has. On July 26, 1989, Fawn worked her shift at Worlds of Fun like any other summer day, serving park guests through the July heat, working a long day shift that rolled straight into the evening shift. Her shift ended at 11 o'clock that night. She went straight home. No detours, no stopping to see friends. She had another shift the next morning, and she knew it. When Fawn walked into the house, her family was already asleep. Her mother, her siblings, all downstairs. The air conditioner ran steadily against the summer heat, its constant hum filling every room, swallowing every other sound in the house. Fawn went up to her own bedroom, on the second floor. She changed out of her uniform, and before lying down, she did one small, ordinary thing that would later become the most devastating detail in the entire case. She set her alarm clock for her shift the next day, because she was responsible, because she didn't want to be late, because setting that alarm was simply a habit she never thought twice about. That was the last thing Fawn Marie Cox ever did. On the morning of July 27, 1989, the alarm clock in Fawn's second-floor bedroom went off. It kept ringing. No footsteps came down the stairs. No voice called out. Just the alarm continuing, while the people downstairs slowly began to register that something was wrong. Fawn's mother and her sister Felicia went upstairs to wake her. Felicia would later describe that moment simply, "I went to shake her. Wake up, wake up." But she had been gone for a long time. Fawn Cox was found in her bed. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled to death, while her family slept directly below her, hearing absolutely nothing. Police arrived and began reconstructing the scene. And the very first detail investigators identified would end up being the most important fact in the entire 31-year case. The killer had not come through the front door, not through a ground floor window. He had climbed up to the second floor and entered through the exact window of Fawn's bedroom, climbing to a second-story window in the middle of the night, quietly enough not to wake an entire household sleeping just below. That is not a random act of opportunity. And the reason no one heard a sound that night was simple. The air conditioner, running constantly against the summer humidity, masked every noise coming from upstairs. Crime scene investigators collected and preserved biological evidence from Fawn's body, and the conclusion drawn from the scene itself was unmistakable. Whoever had done this had chosen that specific house, climbed through that specific window, moved through the house in the dark, and left again, all without waking a single person sleeping one floor below. This was not the behavior of a stranger encountering the house for the first time. From that moment forward, the investigation centered on one question: not who in the neighborhood might have done this, but who among the people Fawn knew, who knew this house, knew which bedroom was hers, knew exactly which window led inside. Investigators focused early on 3 teenagers from the northeast Kansas City neighborhood, young men that witnesses linked to the crime, and that circumstantial evidence at the time appeared to support. All 3 were charged in Fawn Cox's murder. Because they were juveniles in 1989, Missouri law sealed their court records. Their names were never released to the public. During questioning, the 3 accused teenagers pointed to the Street Dog Gang, a local group, known for trouble in the neighborhood, as a possible explanation. One of the 3 teenagers, was held in custody for 8 months while DNA testing was carried out 8 months for something he had not done, while Donald Cox Jr. continued living freely, unquestioned, in the same community. The DNA technology available in 1989 could only compare blood types and run basic genetic analysis, and the results came back inconclusive. Not enough to convict, not enough to fully clear anyone either. A result the system simply did not know what to do with. Then the case fell apart entirely. The central witness and the person whose statement had formed the foundation of the charges against all 3 teenagers recanted, admitting they had lied. With no witness statement, no conclusive DNA, and no physical evidence connecting any of the 3 to Fawn's death, every charge was dropped. All 3 were released, 3 innocent people. One of them had already lost 8 months of his life in custody for a crime he never committed. Meanwhile, the man who had actually climbed through that second-floor window on July 26, 1989, remained completely unsuspected. The case went cold with no suspects left standing. In the years that followed, Fawn's friends from Northeast High School kept asking each other questions that had no answers. And the biological evidence, the perpetrator's own bodily fluids, collected from Fawn's body and locked away in KCPD storage, sat waiting for the technology to eventually catch up. In the early 2000s, the KCPD crime lab reanalyzed those samples using DNA technology, far more advanced than what existed in 1989, finally producing a complete genetic profile of the suspect from material that had been sitting in storage for over a decade. That profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's National Criminal DNA Database, which holds the genetic profiles of people who have been arrested and tested within the justice system. There was no match. Fawn's killer was not in CODIS, not because he didn't exist, but because he had never been arrested for anything requiring his DNA to enter the system. CODIS can only return a name for someone already inside it. 31 years ago, a 16-year-old girl in Kansas City, Missouri was raped and murdered in her own bedroom, while her entire family slept 1 floor below. Completely unaware, investigators arrested 3 teenagers from the neighborhood. One of them spent 8 months in jail before the case against all 3 collapsed completely. Meanwhile, the person who actually climbed through that bedroom window that night kept living in the same community, never once suspected. For 31 years, generation after generation of Kansas City detectives refused to let the case die. They kept meeting with the family. They kept the evidence in storage, waiting. Then in 2020, a single DNA test returned a name. Through multiple generations of detectives, the Kansas City Police Department never let the Fawn Cox case disappear into a filing cabinet. KCPD Captain Ben Caldwell, who once supervised the department's missing persons and cold case section, described it plainly. This case touched a lot of people because it was an innocent child killed in her own bed. It haunted the detectives and officers who worked on it for decades. The cold case unit continued meeting periodically with the Cox family over the years, not as a formality, but as a standing commitment. Caldwell spoke with clear respect about the original 1989 investigative team, noting they had worked the case to its limits, pursuing every lead available with the technology and resources of their time. When advanced genetic genealogy began cracking cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable, most famously, the Golden State Killer case in 2018, followed by dozens of others across the country, Caldwell recognized immediately what this technology could offer Fawn's case. Where CODIS required the suspect's own DNA to already be in the system, genetic genealogy could search for distant relatives in public genealogy databases instead. But Caldwell was candid about the obstacle. Genetic genealogy testing was expensive, complex, and out of reach for many police departments working with limited budgets. KCPD needed outside resources to make it happen. That opportunity arrived in 2020 through Operation Legender, a federal initiative that brought additional resources into Kansas City to help solve violent crimes. The department was able to overcome the cost barrier that had stood in the way. The FBI's Kansas City field office partnered with KCPD to run advanced genetic genealogy analysis on the evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1989. Unlike CODIS, this technique didn't search for an exact match in a criminal database. It searched for partial matches, distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their own DNA to public genealogy databases to research their family history, never imagining their genetic information would one day help identify a relative's crime. The answer came back in a matter of weeks. Not years, not months. Weeks, a speed that was almost impossible for a family who had waited 31 years to fully absorb. This became the first murder case in Kansas City Police Department history, solved using advanced genetic genealogy, a historic first for the department. And the result confirmed something Caldwell had suspected from the very first day he looked at that crime scene. Whoever killed Fawn Cox knew her, knew the house, and knew exactly which window to climb through to get in and out undetected. The DNA did not point to a stranger. It did not point to a gang member or an outsider from another part of the neighborhood. It pointed to family. The name was Donald Cox, Jr., Fawn's own cousin, 21 years old in the summer of 1989 when Fawn was 16. Not an outsider, not a stranger who could be turned away at the door. A relative, someone who could walk into the Cox family home on East 9th Street without anyone questioning why he was there. Someone who already knew the layout of the house, who already knew which second-floor bedroom belonged to Fawn, who already knew which window could be climbed through without drawing attention, who understood, perhaps better than anyone outside the family could, that the air conditioner running on a humid Kansas City night would cover whatever sound he made. Between November 9th and 11th, 2020, KCPD sat down with the Cox family and delivered the answer they had waited 31 years to hear. Donald Cox, Jr. was no longer alive to face it. He had died in 2006, years before the genetic genealogy results came back. His death had originally been investigated as suspicious, though it was ultimately determined not to involve foul play. As part of that medical examiner's investigation, a blood sample had been collected and retained. It was that sample, pulled from an unrelated death, investigation 14 years earlier, that the KCPD crime lab compared against the DNA recovered from Fawn's body in 1989. It was a match, because Donald Cox Jr. was never charged with any crime. KCPD did not officially release his name, in keeping with the legal principle that someone who was never formally accused should not be publicly identified by police. It was the Cox family themselves who chose to share his name when they spoke to reporters. There was no trial, no conviction, no moment where Donald Cox Jr. stood before a judge and answered for what he did to his 16-year-old cousin on that summer night in 1989. He never had to face any of it. The resolution of the Fawn Cox case carried a second, quieter kind of pain. The family didn't only lose Fawn in 1989. In November 2020, they lost something else. Their trust in someone they had called family for their entire lives. Felicia Cox put it as simply as it could be put. The answers aren't always what we were asking for, but there's closure. For 31 years, the family had pictured Fawn's killer as a stranger, a gang member, someone from outside their world entirely. The truth was someone already inside it, something nobody wanted to accept and yet had to. There would be no answers about why. Donald Cox Jr. had been gone for over a decade by the time his name surfaced, and whatever drove him to climb through his 16-year-old cousin's window that night will never be fully known. The Fawn Cox case leaves 3 lessons worth carrying forward. The first belongs to the crime scene investigators of 1989. They collected and properly preserved biological evidence from Fawn's body at a time when no one could have imagined what 2020 technology would eventually be able to do with it. That single decision, made with no knowledge of genetic genealogy, no knowledge of what would be possible 3 decades later, became the entire foundation that made the 2020 breakthrough possible. Without it, there is no resolution to this case at all. If you have a loved one connected to a cold case, there's a direct question worth asking the investigating agency. Is the biological evidence still preserved? And has it been retested using current DNA technology? The second lesson is about the barrier Caldwell spoke about so openly: cost. He knew as early as 2018 that genetic genealogy could likely solve Fawn's case. But the expense and complexity of that testing kept it out of reach for years, until federal funding through Operation Legend made it possible. This is not unique to Kansas City. Thousands of cold cases across America could potentially be solved with this same technology, but many police departments simply don't have the budget to access it. If you're connected to a cold case at a smaller department without those resources, it's worth researching nonprofit organizations that help connect families directly to genetic genealogy, services the department itself can't afford. The third lesson is about why 31 years of traditional investigation missed the right person entirely. The actual killer was a family member, someone who would never be treated with the same suspicion as a stranger, someone who had every legitimate reason to know the layout of that house, and no need to explain his presence in it. The detail that the killer clearly knew: the house wasn't just a technical note about how he got in. It was the single most important clue to his identity. And that is exactly why it took a completely different kind of tool, not traditional police work, but genetic genealogy, to finally reach him. If you've watched this far, leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And hit subscribe, so you don't miss the next one.